I'm sure you've been thinking for a while now about why the country as a whole is taking all this bollocks. The lockdowns, the masks, the business closures, the hassle from the police, the obedience. Sure, there'll always be people who are too dumb to read surveys, too cowardly to stand up to a Tesco security guard, or too trusting to actually ask for evidence of anything. Also, the furlough cash has simply bribed lots of people, but I couldn't believe everyone was like this. There had to be something more. What's the mentality behind this? Now, a lot of people have made comparisons from literature such as 1984 or Brave New World or Fahrenheit 451, and they all contain excellent representations of what's going on today, but what's driving people's behaviour? I think I found the answer in Nietzsche's classic work from the 1880s, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The reason for the gutless compliance is the almost complete emasculation of most modern men. The early 21st century Western man is a neutered, impotent consumer. They consume heavily advertised products from mega corporations in the pursuit of pleasure and hedonism, but this is ultimately empty, and so they try and drug themselves with ever more consumption in a vicious cycle which can never lead anywhere. It's a gutless egalitarian conformity which leaves them terrified to stand up and stand out. So they cower in groupthink and group identity, never once daring to say, for example, if you have a penis, you're a man, whatever you might think or wish, or any one of a dozen other forbidden thoughts. This is modern day wrongthink, so they shut up, never daring once to look up from their skinny soy latte and iPhones, even as their country and their lives are being destroyed by lockdowns. They are fearful, cowardly, mediocre, and useless. I think this is why a lot of them have beards. It's a pathetic and futile last-ditch attempt to prove they're still men. They're not. Nihilism has corrupted them to such a degree they can't see any reason for existence, so there's no good, no bad, no evil, no virtue, and certainly nothing worth risking their miserable necks for. Nietzsche called people like this the last man. The last man is the archetypal nihilist, only able to destroy but unable to build or act upon any self-actualized ethos. Think about that. There's real truth in these words. There's a desperate danger in existential nihilism, and we're seeing that playing out today. And with the disappearance of God and the collapse of religious beliefs, you get the emergence of a death anxiety, which really drives the paranoia and fear. Right now, that fear is focused on the virus, but it's easily manipulated, and in the future, it'll be something else. Nietzsche warned us that the society of the last man would be too empty and decadent to support the growth of healthy human life or great individuals. The last man is only possible by mankind having bred an apathetic, emasculated man who loses his ability to dream, to strive, and to take risks. Instead, he's simply concerned with earning a living, buying junk he doesn't need, taking drugs, and keeping warm. This explains cancel culture and the refusal to hear non-approved ideas. Doesn't this exactly sum up the COVID coward hiding behind his useless mask, ducking away from human contact, hiding under his bed and obeying every stupid edict from the government? This is the mentality of a slave. If, however, you don't buy into the mainstream narrative about Wu Flu, I'll bet real money you're either a religious person who finds meaning and values from their belief system and doesn't fear death, or you are what Nietzsche called an ubermensch. Now, this word's got a terrible rap because of its association with Nazism, and of course, I don't mean it or advocate it in that context whatsoever. Nietzsche said the Enlightenment in the 18th century and the search for truth meant for many people the death of God as religious beliefs declined. With the disappearance of God and with him Christian values, society can and does give way to nihilism, as we've previously discussed. But the ubermensch can and does think for him or herself. They are motivated by a love of this world and a love of life. They derive value and meaning from it. This is why we react so strongly against some of these pointless shackles and restrictions. The emasculated nihilists, by contrast, easily tolerate it. Some even embrace it as they think it means their safety. Nietzsche thought that greater men, those who think and speak for themselves, those who aren't afraid to publicly step outside the mainstream narrative, are secretly envied but publicly ridiculed. Doesn't this explain a lot of the hostility we face today? Let that sink in. We get so much hostility because the slaves secretly envy our courage and our values and ability to think independently. He talked about the slave mindset of obedience, patience, and humility. Think about that. Obedience, patience, humility. Isn't that exactly what you need to accept the mainstream narrative and lockdowns without protest? Obedience. Do as you're told. Don't question. Don't think. Obey. Patience. It's only 3 weeks to flatten the curve. It's only 1 lockdown. Okay, 2 lockdowns. Okay, until Easter. Well, maybe next Christmas. Humility. Don't question. Accept that Boris and Whitty and Valence know best. This is the near perfect mindset of the COVID coward. They are afraid of hardship and struggle. By contrast, we know that sometimes part of the human existence is struggle and hardship and suffering. We don't try and avoid these at any cost. Instead, we try to make a balanced calculation. We assess risk. We know that in the struggle, in the fire of the forge, character is formed. We don't look to the government to absolutely protect us from everything because we can think and take responsibility for ourselves. And here we are in the postmodern hellscape of the West, a society that preaches pacifism and tolerance and weakness as virtues. Individuality is suppressed, egalitarianism is promoted, and society is on the skids. All major political parties talk about equality and diversity as if these were unarguably good things, as opposed to contradictory and easily debunked wish thinking. Now, I'm sure you'll have heard the saying, the things you own end up owning you. It's an obvious critique of consumerism. And that's why we aren't bought off with Rishi Sunak's furlough bribes. We know you can't buy self-worth when you buy consumer goods. The desire to build a society where pain and suffering can be eliminated completely is utterly utopian. The effort inevitably leads to a vast expansion of the state, as we've seen recently, and ultimately a dictatorship. Isn't that where we're headed? The government, the state, our NHS say they can protect you from death, and that's why we have to protect and worship them. But this belief turns self-reliant humans into little more than pack animals who, if not ignorant of their own mortality, seem unwilling to contemplate it. Far better to confront your own mortality head on, and in so doing lose your fear of it. And when you no longer fear death, you no longer fear pandemics, real or otherwise. Now, I don't agree with the will to power at all costs stuff. That can lead to some dark and tyrannical places. But absolutely, we need to be strong in our rational self-belief. The decline of Christianity led to the rise of egalitarian movements throughout the West, but that egalitarianism leads to emasculation of men and the slave mentality, as we discussed, of obedience, patience, and humility. So this isn't just a fight about COVID restrictions, it's a challenge to the herd mentality, to egalitarianism, and to identity politics that's dominating and strangling the West today. And this is the fight, like it or not, it's the one we're in. So by default, we find ourselves as a group of ubermensch who can change this. We're the only ones who can. There's no one else. Politicians and vaccines aren't going to do it. I think as a group we instinctively know this. How many times have you seen posts saying, this only ends when we end it? It's true. So the obvious question is, how do we end this? This video is getting quite long, so I'll do that in a part 2. If you like this, please like, recommend, and subscribe.